On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit, and thus began the space race. In this video, we will look at how the launch of Sputnik in 1957 sparked the space race and why it shocked the United States. We will trace the Soviet Union's early victories, from Yuri Gagarin's historic flight to Valentina Tereshkova's groundbreaking mission. We will also see how the United States responded by creating NASA, strengthening education, and setting the ambitious goal of reaching the moon.
Eisenhower announces the U.S. will launch a scientific satellite as part of IGY.
The roots of the space race began in the years after the Second World War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as global superpowers and were locked in a bitter rivalry that soon became known as the Cold War. Each side wanted the ability to strike anywhere on Earth with nuclear bombs. To deliver these weapons, both nations turned to rockets. During the war, German scientists had built the V-2 rocket, the first long-range missile capable of reaching the edge of space. When the war ended in 1945, both the US and the USSR rushed to capture these scientists and their technology. The United States brought more than 100 German engineers to work under a secret program called Operation Paperclip, while the Soviets also seized their share of experts and equipment. From this point, rockets became the foundation of the Cold War. For the Americans, rockets were about defending freedom and staying ahead. And for the Soviets, the rockets offered a chance to show the strength of their socialist system. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Premier Nikita Khrushchev, was pouring resources into developing powerful intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. At the center of this effort was a man named Sergei Korolev. Korolev was known only as the chief designer to the outside world. His identity was kept a secret because of the importance of his work. He had survived imprisonment during Stalin's purges and now held the future of Soviet rocketry in his hands. His vision extended beyond weapons. He dreamed of sending satellites and eventually people into space. For Korolev and Khrushchev, space exploration was not just science. It was politics, proving that communism could outpace capitalism. On October 4, 1957, this dream finally became a reality. On that day, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. It was a polished metal sphere that weighed about 184 pounds and carried a simple radio transmitter. As it orbited Earth, it sent out a steady beep, 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 that could be heard by radios around the globe. As simple as those beeps were, they shook the United States. To the Soviets, Sputnik was a triumph. To Americans, it was a shock. Newspapers reported that the USSR had surpassed American science. Military officials warned that the same rockets carrying satellites could also deliver nuclear warheads to American cities. And so, ordinary people stood outside at night, scanning the skies to catch a glimpse of the moving dot overhead. The event became known as the Sputnik Crisis, a moment when Americans truly feared they were falling behind. After the launch of Sputnik 1, the Soviets moved quickly to press their advantage. On November 3, 1957, just a month after Sputnik 1, they launched Sputnik 2. This satellite carried Laika, a stray dog picked from the streets of Moscow.
Laika was to be the Earth's first traveler into space. Here is Laika in his capsule, which will be placed inside the satellite. There were instruments to test his reaction to cosmic rays, radiation, heat, cold, and weightlessness. In these exclusive Soviet films, Sputnik 2 is shown in its pre-launch preparation. The Russian satellite weighed 1,120 pounds, 10 times heavier than the first Sputnik.
Laika became the first living creature to orbit Earth. Unfortunately, her mission ended in tragedy, as there was no plan to bring her home. However, it demonstrated that living beings could survive the stresses of launch and weightlessness. For the Soviets, it was yet again another bold step, but for the Americans, it was another humiliating loss. The United States scrambled to catch up. Early attempts at launching satellites failed spectacularly, with rockets exploding on live television. But at last, on the 1st of February, 1958, the United States succeeded. A small satellite named Explorer 1 reached orbit. The American flag had entered space.
Okay, check the utility room fuel vapors and notify the blockhouse when we're clear to start generator. Connect assembly to igniter. Okay, tie down the lead. Roger, install your protective tab. AFMTC telemeter calibration tape on. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire command. Fire command. Fuel tank pressurized. Block tank pressurized. Missile power. Ignition. Base tank. Lift off. Lift off.
Soon after, the government realized it needed a more organized approach. And so, in 1958, it created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, as a civilian agency dedicated to space exploration. Congress also passed the National Defense Education Act, funneling money into science, mathematics, and engineering to ensure the next generation could compete with the Soviets. But the USSR still wasn't slowing down. On April 12, 1961, it achieved its most stunning victory yet. A 27-year-old Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a spacecraft called Vostok 1, launched atop a massive R-7 rocket designed by Korolev. Gagarin orbited Earth once before safely returning. He had become the first human in space, and he was an instant hero not just in the Soviet Union, but across the world. Posters with his smiling face spread across cities. Crowds cheered his name. Even in the West, admiration for Gagarin was widespread, though it was mixed with deep unease. The United States had to respond. Just a few weeks later, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress on May 25, 1961. In a bold speech, he declared that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely before the end of the decade.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
The promise was breathtaking. At that point, America had only managed a single suborbital flight lasting 15 minutes with astronaut Alan Shepard. But Kennedy's words gave the United States a clear and ambitious target. The space race was no longer just about satellites or short flights. It was about the moon. The years that followed saw a dramatic back and forth. On February 20, 1962, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth aboard Friendship 7. His safe return lifted American spirits. On June 16, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space, spending nearly 3 days orbiting Earth aboard Vostok 6. Her achievement gave the Soviet Union another symbolic victory. The competition pushed into new territory, which was spacewalking. On March 18, 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov floated outside his Voskhod 2 spacecraft, becoming the first person to walk in space. He risked his life when his suit ballooned dangerously, and he barely squeezed back into his capsule. Just 3 months later, on June 3, 1965, American astronaut Ed White performed his own spacewalk during Gemini 4. Drifting above Earth while tethered to his capsule, for the first time, humans were working outside their spacecraft. Throughout the mid-1960s, the United States pushed forward with the Mercury and Gemini programs. These missions were designed to master the skills needed for the Moon. We're talking long-duration flights, space rendezvous, and docking spacecraft together. American astronauts learned step by step, building experience that would pave the way for Apollo. Meanwhile, the Soviet program was facing hidden troubles. Sergei Korolev, the man who had driven its successes, died suddenly during surgery in 1966. His death was a heavy blow. Without him, rivalries among engineers slowed progress. The USSR still had impressive rockets and courageous cosmonauts, but its leadership was fractured. By the mid-1960s, the picture was clear. The Soviet Union had seized the early lead, thrilling the world with Sputnik, Gagarin, and Tereshkova. But the United States, with Kennedy's vision, NASA's growing expertise, and unmatched financial resources, was catching up quickly. The next phase of the space race would bring both tragedy and triumph as the two superpowers raced to claim the ultimate prize, which was to be the first ones to land humans on the Moon. By the late 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had made bold progress, but the road to the Moon would prove dangerous. Unfortunately, tragedy struck both sides before either could claim victory. On January 27, 1967, the United States faced a devastating setback. During a ground test for the first crewed Apollo mission, a fire broke out inside the command module. 3 astronauts, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, were trapped inside. The pure oxygen atmosphere fed the flames, and within seconds, all 3 were dead. The accident shocked the nation. Newspapers described it as a disaster for NASA. The Apollo program was halted all whilst engineers redesigned the spacecraft and tightened safety procedures. For many, the dream of reaching the Moon seemed to slip further away. Just 3 months later, the Soviet Union suffered its own tragedy. On April 23, 1967, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov launched aboard Soyuz 1. Although initially the spacecraft was plagued with problems. One of its solar panels failed to deploy, leaving it short of power. Still, Komarov bravely attempted to bring the craft back to Earth. On re-entry, the parachutes malfunctioned and Soyuz 1 slammed into the ground. Komarov became the first human to die during an actual spaceflight. His funeral was on broadcast across the Soviet Union, a somber reminder of the risks every cosmonaut faced. Despite these losses, the race pressed on. The United States worked tirelessly to recover. In December 1968, NASA launched Apollo 8, the first crewed mission to orbit the Moon. Astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders circled the Moon 10 times before returning home safely. The mission gave the world one of the most iconic photographs ever taken, the Earthrise. From lunar orbit, Anders captured the sight of our planet rising above the barren Moon. The picture showed Earth as a small, fragile blue sphere against the vast blackness of space. It was a moment that inspired awe and also stirred a new awareness of humanity's shared home. But the true climax of the race came in July 1969. On the 16th of that month, Apollo 11 blasted off with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, and descended toward the Moon's surface, all while Collins remained in orbit. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the moon and spoke the words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, and one giant leap for mankind." Moments later, Buzz Aldrin joined him. Together, they planted the American flag, collected samples, and conducted experiments while 500 million people watched on television. The United States had done it. Kennedy's challenge, made 8 years earlier, had been fulfilled. America had landed on the moon before the decade's end. Around the world, reactions poured in. Allies of the U.S. cheered, while the Soviets remained quiet. The propaganda battle was over and the United States had won. The Soviet Union never landed a man on the moon. Their efforts to build a massive rocket, the N-1, ended in repeated disasters. On one occasion, the rocket exploded in a fireball so large it destroyed the entire launch pad. Without Korolev's leadership and facing technical setbacks, the Soviet lunar dream collapsed. But the story did not end with Apollo 11. In the early 1970s, NASA launched more lunar missions. Apollo 12 in November 1969 landed near the unmanned Surveyor 3 probe. Apollo 13 in April 1970 became one of the most dramatic missions of all, not because of success, but because of survival. 2 days after launch, an oxygen tank exploded on board, crippling the spacecraft. Astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were forced to abandon their lunar landing plans and fight for their lives. Using improvised solutions and guided by engineers on the ground, the crew managed to loop around the moon and return safely to Earth. The words "Houston, we have a problem" became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Other Apollo missions brought new achievements. Apollo 14 in 1971 saw Alan Shepard, America's first astronaut in space, walk on the moon and famously hit golf balls across its dusty surface. Apollo 15, also in 1971, introduced the lunar rover, allowing astronauts to travel miles across the terrain. Apollo 16 in 1972 focused on scientific exploration, while Apollo 17, the final mission in December 1972, carried scientist-astronaut Harrison Schmitt. It was the longest stay on the moon, and it marked the end of an extraordinary era. By then, the United States had firmly established its dominance. The Soviet Union shifted its strategy. Rather than racing to the moon, it concentrated on building space stations. In 1971, the Soviets launched Salyut-1, the world's first space station. Though the mission was cut short after technical problems, it marked the beginning of a new focus: long-term human habitation in orbit. The space race officially reached its symbolic conclusion in July 1975 with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. For the first time, American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts met in space. An Apollo spacecraft, commanded by Thomas Stafford, docked with a Soviet Soyuz, commanded by Alexei Leonov, the same cosmonaut who had made the first spacewalk a decade earlier. The crews shook hands, exchanged gifts, and worked together on experiments. For many, this moment represented a turning point. Instead of competing, the two superpowers were cooperating. Reactions to the Apollo-Soyuz mission were warm and hopeful. Newspapers described it as a handshake in space. Television audiences watched as two rivals of the Cold War found common ground above the Earth. It was a fitting end to nearly 2 decades of fierce competition. The legacy of the space race stretched far, even after the Cold War. Technologies developed for rockets and spacecraft found their way into everyday life, from improved computers to medical devices. The race inspired a new generation of scientists and engineers, fueled education reforms, and gave humanity a new perspective on its place in the universe. The iconic images of Earth from space reminded people everywhere that borders and rivalries seemed small compared to the shared fragility of our planet. But questions remain. Why did the Soviets lose Sergei Korolev, their chief designer, at such a critical moment? Were the repeated N-1 rocket failures simply technical or the result of secrecy and pressure? Why did the United States stop lunar missions after Apollo 17 despite success? And was Apollo-Soyuz true cooperation or mostly Cold War theater? But most of all, if the race had been driven by unity rather than rivalry, how much further could humanity have gone? If you enjoyed watching this video, please leave a like, share, and comment your thoughts on this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.